There's a pretty well-established tradition in video games that crystallizes an expectation that the player will sympathize or even actively endorse the actions of the character that they're controlling on the screen. This is most easily realized in role-playing games where the character on the screen is some nameless vessel through which the players act out their own motivations and goals and desires. These games put so much of the character's decision-making in the player's hands that even individual dialogue options are among the many choices that the player can make, not to mention the skills that the player develops for the character, the relationships that they pursue, and even the fashion the character dons. This gets a bit more nuanced and complicated when games are trying to tell a narrative story, where the characters are named already and have relationships and personalities determined by the lore of the world. Games like The Last of Us and Firewatch, God of War, or Horizon Zero Dawn. In order to progress the story that the developers and writers want to tell, these characters have to make certain decisions independent of the actual desires of the player. However, all of these games generally do a good job of aligning the players with the characters that they're controlling, so that the players are on board with the decisions that the characters make within the context of the story that's being told. Spoilers for any of these games, but for example, by the end of The Last of Us, players are pretty much completely supportive of Joel's decision to save Ellie. In God of War, we understand Kratos' need to go retrieve his Blades of Chaos, despite the history they hold for him. Interestingly enough, it's often the RPGs, rife with choice, that break the connection between player and character.
Sorry, can't let that happen.
Oh! No, my leg!
Yeah, in no world would I expect to shove Dijkstra aside forcefully would mean deliver a devastating 1-2 combo and then ruthlessly break his leg, but add a way to deliver a message, I guess, Geralt. So this tradition of aligning the player with the character was pretty much shattered by one of the most controversial video game releases to date, The Last of Us Part 2. Because of some of the leaks for the game, before it was even released, The Last of Us Part 2 has been the center of, we'll say, lively debate regarding some of the choices made about playable segments. Huge spoilers for the game, obviously. If you haven't played it or you're planning to, turn this video off now and come back to it later. For those of you still here, I want to talk about the choice that the devs made in The Last of Us Part 2 to alienate the player from certain characters we were put in control of, like Abby, and in distancing the player from some of the decisions that fan favorites like Ellie were making within the context of the game. I'll be doing this by looking at the game through a tradition in philosophy called Hermeneutics, a tradition that's focused on understanding through interpretation. How do certain choices that the creators make affect the meaning of a piece of art? How does an audience's relationship with characters affect their interpretation of the work? What happens if an interpretation is different from the intended meaning? And how does all of that come to play in the very divisive decisions that Naughty Dog made in developing The Last of Us Part 2? I'll be talking about this through the hermeneutics of Hans-Georg Gadamer specifically, focusing mainly on what he calls the fusion of horizons. However you feel about The Last of Us Part 2, I don't think there's any denying that it at least started a conversation. Twitter, Reddit, and YouTube have all been incredibly busy debating the worth of certain characters, the meaning of certain narrative choices, and even the justifications for choices that characters make in-game. Now, it's probably tempting, given how divided the whole internet is in discussing the actual meaning of the game, to simply dismiss it as a failure. After all, it failed to reliably portray the message that it was trying to portray. But contrary to that temptation, the fact that everyone is divided about the story and narrative meaning is actually a testament to its status as a work of fiction. Think of all the various parables you've heard throughout your life, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf or the story of the tortoise and the hare. Sure, there are easy interpretations of either of these stories, but there are other lessons that can be taken from them. The Boy Who Cried Wolf could be a warning about the consequences of dismissal. Instead of being a message that slow and steady wins the race, the tortoise and the hare could be communicating the importance of always giving 100% and never being complacent. The point here is that your complaints in high school English classes about the author never actually intending any of the symbolism that your teacher seemed to force out of the text are actually kind of on point, but they are crucially missing half of the equation in interpretation. Take the famous painting Nighthawks by Edward Hopper, for example. A lot of popular interpretations of Nighthawks and many of Hopper's paintings involve invoking some sense of isolation or loneliness. For this particular painting, people point to the lack of a door, the visible absence of an entrance or exit, to claim that Hopper was making some sort of commentary about isolation, even when there's a larger world or city around you. But, according to the Art Institute of Chicago, Hopper denied that he purposely infused this or any of his other paintings with symbols of human isolation and urban emptiness. But he acknowledged that in Nighthawks, quote, unconsciously, probably, I was painting the loneliness of a large city. See, when creators are making something to be consumed by an audience, whether that's a piece of music, a work of art, or a story, they're creating it for that audience. That means that they have to understand that their work is going to be picked up and analyzed through the lens of individuals who have had experiences in their life that the creator has never experienced themselves, or has never even considered. As a result, the work is going to be seen very differently by very different people. The two viewpoints here, the audience on the one hand and the creator on the other, are what Gadamer calls horizons. Horizon is just a fancy way to talk about the context that something is situated within. This includes its historical context and prevailing prejudices of the time, relational context involving all of the various relationships that the thing finds itself within, etc. Basically, anything that can be considered relevant in fully understanding the thing we're discussing are a part of its horizon. And everything has horizons, including you and me. And just an important note here, the term prejudice for Gadamer is not a derogatory word. He uses it in its most literal way to just mean prejudgments, understandings that you have about things that you're bringing to a work that you're interpreting. And for Gadamer, a crucial step in interpreting anything is acknowledging your own prejudices that you have and how they're affecting your interpretation. A perfect example of this is the prejudice about Joel that both the writers and the audience bring to the table within the context of The Last of Us Part 2. In Part 1, the entire focus of the story was on Joel, reconnecting with a part of himself that he buried after the loss of his daughter. That redemption arc, from cold smuggler to loving father, is what solidifies Joel, in a lot of people's eyes, as the hero of the story. He did what he had to do to protect the ones that he loves. Now, I think the writers of Part 2 brought that same prejudice to the table. It would honestly be a surprising lack of awareness if they didn't, given the critical acclaim of the first game and the audience's reactions when they first saw Joel in the story reveal trailer. But understanding at least part of the prejudgment about Joel that the audience would have, they made the decision that they thought would motivate the player on Ellie's quest. They stole a hero away from you, and were banking on the fact that the judgment you were bringing to the game about Joel would push you forward throughout the rest of the game. And as far as I can tell, for everyone, those who loved the game and those who hated the game, they were right. Everyone, at least initially, wanted to avenge Joel. But sometimes there's a disconnect between how the audience is approaching a work and how the artist is presenting the work, like with Hopper's Nighthawks. When this happens, the act of interpretation becomes a distinctly active and practical endeavor. Gadamer claims that one of the main ways that our prejudices help us to understand a text through interpretation is by forcing us to become actively engaged in a dialogue with the work we're interpreting. Our prejudices not only inform and open certain aspects of the text for conversation, but the work that we're engaging with will reveal some of our prejudices that we weren't necessarily aware of before. And depending on the prejudices that we bring to bear on a work, the interpretation of that work will change. Think about how two different people might approach Captain America: Civil War. Depending on their values and even their preference of heroes, one person could very reasonably consider Cap to be the hero of that story, and one person could very reasonably consider Tony to be the hero, even though they're directly in conflict with one another throughout the entire narrative. Now, the thing that makes Gadamer's use of hermeneutics and interpretation interesting is that he would claim both of these individuals, both the Cap fan and the Tony fan, would have pulled some amount of truth from the movie. This is because the act of interpretation is a process of, quote, unconcealment, where certain things about a work are only revealed through particular lenses with particular prejudices. Every interpretation, then, reveals something true about the text, while at the same time obscuring other aspects of it. The truth that is unconcealed, or revealed in less jargony language, is what we can consider a new horizon, a separate historical context that's born out of the marriage between the work and the prejudgments that an audience bring to it. Putting these two horizons together, we participate in a fusion of horizons, and every act of interpretation, properly done, is a reenactment of this process of revealing truth and marriage of horizons. The Last of Us Part 2 as a work to be interpreted is fascinating to me because it does something that fundamentally breaks so many molds and expectations. It revels in disconnects it makes between player and character instead of trying to coerce alignment between them. The player, at least from what I'm gathering in my own playthroughs and watching streamers and YouTubers, often doesn't want to do what the game is forcing the player to do. I think the most universal moment where this happens is when the player controlling Abby has to fight Ellie at the end of the second Seattle Day 3 chapter. But it happens more than that. Players don't want to hit Nora with a pipe at all, much less 3 times. Some people don't want to fight Abby while controlling Ellie at the end of the game. Others don't want to let Abby go in that same situation. Some players don't want to leave the farm for the first time, and for some, entire stretches of the game are objectionable because they don't want to control Abby at all. I have never seen a game so completely break the tradition of aligning the player with the character that they're controlling. By doing this, Naughty Dog makes these characters out to be more than just vehicles that we, as players, can act out our own version of ubiquitous narrative tropes like the quest archetype or the revenge tale with. And because they put us behind the stick, they force us to interact in a way that makes us responsible for those decisions in ways that movies and books don't. Neil Druckmann sums up this sensation perfectly. He says, "There's something interesting that happens when you're not in alignment with the character and the game makes you do something that you don't want to do. You wrestle with those decisions in a different way than you would be able to in a passive medium." Putting this in the language of our philosophical lens for this video, somehow this game creates a third horizon that we have to grapple with in order to create our interpretation for the game. There's still the original two, the game, and then us, the audience, but somehow, now, the characters are a wholly different horizon that the game is asking us to grapple with. They are entire worlds on their own that we have to try to understand. Other games generate empathy for character decisions throughout the process of playing them. We not only understand the practical reasons behind why a character is doing what they're doing, but we empathize and actively endorse the motivations that they have. The Last of Us Part 2 only gives us the first half of that equation. I understand that Ellie feels she needs to torture Nora to get information about where Abby is, but asking me to endorse torturing someone with a pipe by having me press the button to do it is an entirely different ask. For some people, getting them to understand that Abby was a person with motivations her own was a big ask in itself, but then asking them to play as her and actively harm Ellie was absolutely objectionable. One of the main strains of critique that I've seen about this game is that the game is judging the player when it forces them to do some of these objectionable actions. That the game is wagging its finger at the player for the violent scenarios it presents and forces the player through. But I don't think that's what the game is doing at all. The game's only ask of the player is to engage with things that make us uncomfortable, to understand why they're uncomfortable, even if we understand particular motivations behind them. Do we get wanting revenge? Sure, in theory. But then the game asks us to engage in the process of actually getting that revenge in a way that most of us would never be able to otherwise, by performing the actions that make that revenge possible. It asks us to try to understand the context of Ellie and the context of Abby, and then put ourselves in their shoes to see how the journey would change us. The game's message has been dismissed and minimized as revenge is bad, but by putting players so at odds with the characters at different points, I think it's more nuanced than that. Yeah, maybe revenge just is bad, but at what point does seeking revenge become too much? By putting the players at odds with the characters, The Last of Us Part 2 gives each player an opportunity to find where their own line is, and as a result, it gives them the tools to analyze why they draw the line where they do. Do you stop when torture is necessary? Do you stop when it puts your friends at risk? Or is justice worth pursuing at any cost whatsoever? The game doesn't present those answers to you neatly and with a bow. It gives you 3 horizons: a character's, your own, and the game's, and it asks you to synthesize them without pushing an answer. And each player will have a different answer depending on how they interpret Abby and Ellie's character and depending on their own prejudices that they bring to the table. Some will claim that as soon as Dina was at risk, Ellie should have turned back. Some will say that as soon as it required torturing someone, Ellie should have stopped. Some will say if it means leaving a life and a family you've created and abandoning your role as a parent, it's not worth pursuing. And some will say it's necessary regardless of the cost, because at the end of the day, at least you'll have had your victory. The Last of Us Part 2, I think, felt so unsatisfying to so many people because it didn't provide any answers to those questions. It didn't give us a definitive moral of the story. By forcing the player to engage in the game in the way that it did, the only way that the player can get closure is by creating their own. Their own closure based on their interpretation of the events and the feelings that they had throughout the game, based on the actions that they endorsed and the actions that they condemned. And so the most uncomfortable aspect of The Last of Us Part 2 is that without wagging a finger, it holds a mirror up to the player in a way that no game has before. It really forces the player to analyze and engage with their own feelings and motivations to see how far they would go when a tale is steeped in violence from the very beginning. But then, in a final twist of the knife, once you think you've figured out where your lines are and what's justifiable under certain circumstances, the game asks you if you're willing to extend the same considerations to someone else. And not just anyone else. The game asks you if you're honest enough with yourself to allow someone the same moral considerations, even if it means that they'll be justified in committing the same acts of violence against you and your loved ones. Are you consistent in your judgment? If not, are you okay with that? And while that might make it uncomfortable or unsatisfying because it asks difficult questions without giving any answers, that's exactly what makes this game interesting and compelling. It's one of the first examples of media that actively engages the audience's agency in the interpretation of the narrative. It understands the active nature of hermeneutic participation. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider sharing it with other people who are dying to have conversations about The Last of Us Part 2. The next video I'll be working on will be analyzing the decisions that Joel made at the end of the first game through the major branches in moral philosophy, and answering whether or not what he did by saving Ellie was morally right or morally wrong. Spoiler alert, it's complicated.